She stood on the block with a rope around her neck. A farmer placed the bid of $250. I've told this story 3 times in my life. Once to a man who didn't believe me, once to a man who did and wept, and once to the woman herself, the night she asked me to. This is the 4th time and the last. It was the 3rd week of October, 1881, outside a place called Gulliver's Crossing, which wasn't much of anything. A trading post, a livery, a saloon with boards so warped you could see daylight through the floor in dry weather, and in wet weather you could smell it before you saw it. I'd been moving cattle up from the flats with 2 other men, Cutter and a boy we called Preacher on account of he never swore. Not once. Not even when a horse fell on him in a creek bed and broke 2 of his ribs. We'd sold the herd 2 days prior in Dunmore and were cutting back south, following the Copperhead Creek Road through stands of cottonwood that had already lost half their leaves, the rest gone yellow and rattling in a thin west wind. We smelled the crowd before we saw it. That's the first thing I remember. The smell. Wood smoke and horses and unwashed wool and something else underneath all of that. That particular human stink of people who have come together for a reason they're not proud of and know it. The smell of a crowd that has convinced itself it's watching something legal. We came around a stand of cottonwoods and there was the square, if you could call it that. It was just a wide patch of hard dirt in front of the trading post, packed down to caliche by years of wagons, and maybe 60 or 70 people standing in a loose ring. Men mostly. A few women at the edges, not watching, looking at the ground or at a point well above the scene, the way women sometimes stand at a thing they don't want to witness but can't bring themselves to leave either, because leaving feels like its own kind of ascent. There was a wagon in the center of the ring with its gate down, making a kind of platform. 2 men stood on it. One was short, maybe 5'4", with a red sash cinched around his middle, and a ledger book tucked under his arm, already into his patter in the practiced way of a man who'd done this enough that the words came without thought. The other was a town constable. I could tell by the badge, a 5-point star that had been bent and hammered flat more than once, with a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, barrel down, watching the crowd with the flat professional expression of a man who had made his peace with what he was paid to do and didn't intend to revisit that arrangement. And on the platform between them was a woman. She was maybe 35. Brown hair, dark with what I took to be creek water, plastered to the side of her neck, and jaw like she'd been through a crossing recently, or like someone had made sure she went through one. She was wearing a wool dress that had been good once, dark green, now gone dull and threadbare at the elbows and hem. Her hands were tied in front of her with a length of thin rope braided cord, the kind you'd use to bundle firewood, knotted tight enough that I could see it had reddened her wrists. That wasn't the rope I mean when I say rope around her neck. They had a loop of heavier cord dropped over her head and down around her shoulders, the kind you'd use on livestock, a catch loop with a running knot, and the end of it was held loose in the constable's left hand, casually, like you'd hold the lead of a horse you weren't worried about. Like the distinction between her and a horse was one he'd stopped considering. She was not crying. I want to be clear about that first before anything else. She was not crying, not looking at the crowd for help, not pleading with her eyes, not showing them any of it. She was looking at a spot somewhere above all of us, some middle distance that didn't contain any of this, some horizon that was hers alone, and her jaw was set so hard I could see the line of it from 40 yards. The line of a woman who has decided that what they take from her today will be only what is taken, not what she gives. Cutter pulled his horse up beside mine, said low and even, "What in the Lord's name?" I didn't answer him. I was watching the auctioneer's mouth. What I could piece together from his patter, catching pieces of it between the crowd noise, facts dropped sideways into the selling, the way these things always worked, information as incidental as weather, was this. The woman was being held on a charge of vagrancy and debt, some amount owed to a man named Colbert who owned the trading post and apparently also owned the constable, or near enough as to make no legal difference in that county. The territorial law, such as it was in that part of the country in 1881, allowed for the indenture of debtors to work off what they owed. It was on paper. It had language around it. Men who had cause to know it well called it what it was, which was a thing that had been illegal in most places for 20 years and had survived in the territories because the territories were not most places, and the men who wrote the laws were often the men who owned the trading posts. The bidding had already started when we rode up. There were maybe a dozen men in the ring who were paying real attention, standing forward, some of them with their arms folded, some with their hats in their hands, watching the platform the way you'd watch a horse at auction, measuring. The rest of the crowd was watching those 12 men the way crowds always watch, for the entertainment of seeing what a thing is worth to somebody. The figure I heard called when we arrived was $140. Someone raised it to $160. Then a man in a canvas coat said $200, and there was a murmur through the crowd, the particular murmur of a crowd that has reached the part it came for. The man in the canvas coat was maybe 35, soft across the jaw, good boots, the kind of man who was accustomed to bidding on things and winning, because he was the kind of man who had decided not to lose. He was already watching her the way a man watches a thing he's planning to acquire. She didn't look at him. She held that far place above all of it with her eyes. Like she had decided the whole of this was going to happen to her body only, and everything else she had taken somewhere else, somewhere internal and unreachable, and put it there for safekeeping until this was over. The canvas coat man put his hand on her arm. Just that one gesture. He reached up and set his hand on her forearm while the bidding was still going, not gripping, just resting his hand there, like a man who is so certain of the outcome that he can afford to begin taking possession early. She still didn't move, she still didn't look at him. But something went out of her face. Not fear, it wasn't fear exactly. More like a woman who has been braced against a door for a long time, and hears someone on the other side begin to throw their weight at it in a new and more deliberate way, and knows the door is old. I looked at Cutter. He looked back at me and he said, quietly and with some real feeling, "Harlan, don't." I said, "How much cash do we have between us?" He closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, then opened them. With Preacher, split out the operating money, travel money total, maybe 400, little more. The auctioneer called $220. I turned my horse and walked it into the ring. People stepped back. I've been told I have a way of moving through a crowd on horseback that makes people step back without quite knowing why they're doing it. I've thought about what it is and I've never settled on an answer. It's just how I sit a horse maybe, something about the angle. I said, loud enough to carry to the edges of the ring, $250. There was a silence, the kind of silence that has weight to it, texture you can almost press your thumb into. The auctioneer looked up at me. He had a face like a thumb, round and featureless and slightly reddened, and said, with the practiced authority of a man who resents interruption, "Sir, this is a legal proceeding." I said $250. Do you want it in coin or paper? The canvas coat man turned to look at me. He took his hand off her arm, I noticed. He didn't do it deliberately. It was just that looking at me required his full attention and his arm came with him. He said, "Who the hell are you?" I didn't answer him. I looked at the auctioneer. The auctioneer looked at the constable. The constable looked at me. He was measuring, the way men do when they're deciding if something is worth the trouble it would take, calculating the specific cost of going against a stranger who sat his horse the way I sat mine, and didn't seem to know he was supposed to feel outnumbered. He must have decided the arithmetic didn't favor him. He stepped back a half step and found something interesting to look at on the toe of his boot. The auctioneer turned back to the ring with the weary expression of a man who sees his commission, staying the same regardless of who pays it. $250, he said. Do I hear $260? The ring was quiet. He waited. The canvas coat man looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. He was deciding whether I was worth the cost of an argument, and I held very still and let him take his time deciding. He looked away first. 250, the auctioneer said. Going once, going twice. Nothing. Sold. I paid with cattle sale money, most of it in 10s and 20s still folded in the breast pocket of my coat from Dunmore. I counted it into the auctioneer's hand there in the dirt while Cutter, without being asked, brought his horse around to the side of the wagon and stood it there between me and the canvas coat man. Just stood his horse there. Cutter was a man of few words and precise judgment. The canvas coat man didn't do anything. He stood and watched and decided, apparently, that what he'd lost was not worth what it would cost to get back. That was the last I saw of him. I don't know what happened to him after. I've made a point over the years of not wondering. One of the auctioneer's men climbed up on the wagon and cut the cord from her wrists with a belt knife. He left the loop around her neck. Didn't bother with that one. Either forgot or didn't consider it his job. She reached up herself and lifted it off over her own head, very deliberately, both hands, and she held it for a moment in front of her, looking at it. Then she dropped it on the boards of the wagon gate. It landed in a coil. She stepped over it, climbed down herself, didn't take any help from anyone, stepped down into the dirt and stood there. She looked up at me. She had dark eyes, brown, with some amber or gold in them that the afternoon light caught at that particular angle, sunburned across the nose and cheekbones and the back of her neck, the burn of someone who worked outside in every season. She was taller than she'd looked from the saddle on the platform, not short, maybe 5'6", with good posture, the posture of a woman who had spent too many years doing too much to afford the luxury of slumping. She said, "What do you want for it?" Just that. Clear voice, no tremor in it, a question asked in the same tone you'd ask a shopkeeper the price of flour. Not grateful, not afraid. Asking the terms of a business arrangement she intended to fully understand before she agreed to it. I said nothing. She looked at me the way a person looks at a word in a foreign language. They're fairly certain they understand, but not certain enough to bet on. I said, "You need somewhere to go. We're heading south. You can ride behind Preacher. He's a decent young man. He won't bother you, and we'll put you somewhere decent before we turn back west." She said, "I can pay you back. Not today, but I can pay you. I have wages owed, 4 months of them, recorded in Colbert's own ledger, and the ledger would hold up in a court, if I can get to a lawyer." "We'll sort that later," I said. "Right now I want to get off this road before dark. Can you ride?" Long pause, thinking it through, running the available options, of which I suspected there were not many. She said yes. All right. I don't think either of us said another word until we were off the road. We rode south for 6 miles before I cut us into a draw where the creek bent back on itself between 2 stands of cottonwood. Good grass, good wood within reach, no sight line from the road, and the creek sound would cover anything moving in the dark. I'd made camps in that draw 3 or 4 times on drives north. It was a place I knew the way you know places you've slept in your body, not just your memory. She sat across the fire from the 3 of us. Not close to us, not away from us, just at the right distance to be part of the camp without being part of anything else. Preacher gave her jerked beef and a tin cup of coffee, and she took both without ceremony and ate and drank the way tired people eat and drink, completely and without comment. She'd dried out by then. The creek water in her hair had gone and it was just brown hair, thick and put up with pins that had mostly given out, coming loose in pieces at the neck. In the firelight she looked like what she was, which was a woman who'd been through something and was on the other side of it, calculating what to do next. Cutter kept his eyes on the fire. He was a man who understood that some situations resolved themselves better if you gave them enough quiet and didn't poke at them. It was Preacher who finally asked, He was 22 and hadn't yet learned that some questions don't need answering tonight, that they'll find their way out in their own time, and asking them before that time is just noise. He looked at her across the fire and said, "How'd you come to owe that man money, ma'am?" She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I didn't." Preacher waited. She didn't continue. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "My husband owed him money. My husband died in April. Colbert came to me in June with his ledger and his constable and his particular reading of the law of indenture." She turned the tin cup in her hands. "I had land and stock. He took those first, transferred to him against the debt. Then he said there was still an amount outstanding." She looked at the fire. There wasn't, but his ledger said there was, and his constable's badge said he was right, and I was a widow woman with no family within 300 miles. The fire cracked. Something in the cottonwoods shifted in the wind, a branch, dry wood settling. I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Ruth Alem." I said, "Harlan Price. These are Cutter and Preacher. Those aren't their real names, but they'll answer to them." Preacher said his real name was Thomas Waite, and he was from Missouri originally. Cutter didn't say anything. Cutter's real name was a thing he kept to himself, and we all honored that. Ruth Alem looked at me across the fire with those dark eyes and said, "Mr. Price, I meant what I asked you." I said, "I heard you." She said, "And?" I said, "And I said nothing. I meant it both times. I bid because I couldn't watch it continue. That's the whole of it." She studied me. The particular quality of how she looked at things, at me, at the fire, at the lip of the tin cup, was something I noticed that first night, even tired and through the firelight. She didn't look at things she wasn't willing to really see. No casual glancing. When she looked at you, you felt looked at. She said, "Men don't generally do things like that for nothing." I said, "Some do." She said, "I've met very few of them." I said, "I know." And that was the end of it that night. She slept on the far side of the fire with the spare blanket Cutter passed over without being asked, and I sat the first watch and listened to the creek over its rocks and thought about the day and about her and about a lot of things, none of them particular. The way your mind goes at night when it's had something to work on and is still working. Morning came cold. She was up before any of us. I heard her before I saw her and had the fire going and the coffee pot on. When I came to the fire, she handed me a cup before I asked for it. She'd found the coffee tin and the pot and the fire iron and the bale hook we used for the lid without any guidance, just by looking at how the camp was laid out. I thought about that, what it meant. A woman who reads the world that carefully. I said, "Thank you." She said, "The coffee's too strong." I put in what was left of the tin. I said, "That's how we make it." She said, "That's how you'll run out of it." I said, "We'll get more in Marcy's Ford." She said, "How far is Marcy's Ford?" I said, 3 days south, maybe a little less if we push. She said, "Does it have a lawyer?" I said, "It has 2. Alcott's the better one." She nodded. That was all the conversation until we broke camp. We rode. The first day out of the draw, she said very little. She rode behind Preacher on his horse, which is an arrangement that requires a degree of trust, and she managed it with her arms loose at her sides rather than holding on to him, balancing with her body the way a person does who grew up on horseback and can do it without thinking. By afternoon she was doing it with her eyes closed, sleeping upright like a cavalry horse. The second day she started asking questions about the country we were passing through, where the water was, where the roads went, what was north and what was west, about cattle, about the trade, about what drove prices up or down, and what the ranchers along the creek bottoms were doing that the ones on the high plains weren't. Not the questions of a frightened person making conversation. The questions of a woman building a picture of her situation, identifying the load-bearing walls. By the third day she was asking me directly, riding up alongside me when the trail widened enough and just starting in without preamble. I found I didn't mind it. Most people ask questions they already know the shape of the answer to, questions that are really just openers for what they want to say. She asked questions she didn't know the answer to, and then listened to what you said. I bought her a horse at a weigh station on the second day, a gray mare, good bone structure, a calm eye, the kind of horse that thinks before it moves. $12, which I thought was fair to everyone. She argued. I said she could pay me back when she had wages again, and she said she intended to have wages again, and I said I knew that, which seemed to settle it. She sat the gray mare the way I'd expected, like she'd owned her for years. She had grown up on a ranch in the Texas Panhandle, she said, before she married a Lem and came north. Her father had run cattle on leased land until the lease went bad, and then they'd tried sheep, and then her father had died and there'd been nothing left to try. She'd married a Lem at 19. He'd been 28. A decent man, she said, steady in his way, but not a man who understood land or cattle the way his ambitions required. She'd spent 7 years learning his operation for him, she said, and doing what it took to keep it from coming apart at the seams. She said all of this plainly, riding alongside me in the October cold with the prairie going brown on either side. No particular emotion in her voice, the way you talk about terrain you've already crossed. I said, "Were you happy?" She thought about that. She said, "Some of it." I said, "That's fair." She said, "He was not a difficult man. That's worth more than people say it's worth." I said, "I think that's true." She looked at me and said, "How long have you been on the range?" I said, "Full time, since about 72. I had a ranch before that." She said, "What happened to it?" I said, "Fire." She said, "And before the fire?" I said, "I had a wife." She said, "What happened to her?" I said, "She died, not in the fire before." That was more than I usually said about it. Most people heard the word fire and were satisfied. She'd kept going and I'd kept answering, which was unusual for me. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Thank you." She said, "How long ago?" I said, 12 years. She said, "Are you sorry about the ranch or about her?" I said, "Both, mostly her." She nodded, didn't say anything more about it, just rode. We reached Marcy's Ford late on the third afternoon. It was a proper town, larger than Gulliver's Crossing by a considerable margin, a main street with a hotel and a bank and a mercantile and 2 saloons, and a doctor's office with a small painted sign. I'd been through it half a dozen times. I knew which building was which and which establishments were reliable. I got her a room at the hotel, paid a week in advance. She said she'd pay me back. I said yes. She said she didn't want me to pay more than that, a week at a time only, because she didn't intend to be here long. I said all right, a week at a time then. She said good. I asked her about dinner and she said not tonight. She needed a hot bath and 12 hours of sleep, and I said I understood, and she went up the stairs of the hotel without looking back, which suited me. I was not a man who needed to be looked at. I found Cutter and Preacher at the saloon. Cutter was playing cards with a patience and attention to detail that generally ended with other men's money in his pocket. Preacher was drinking water at the bar, which earned him looks and not seeming to mind them. I sat down and ordered a whiskey and didn't say anything for a while. Cutter said, not looking up from his cards, "You're staying." I said, "A few days." He said, "Longer than that." Preacher said, "She seems like a good woman." I said, "She is." Cutter laid down his hand and raked in what was in the center of the table and said, to no one in particular, "A few days, sure." Dinner was the following evening. She'd found a dress somewhere, dark blue wool, plain but whole and clean. She'd done something with her hair that made it look deliberate, twisted up with better pins, a different woman than the one I'd bought off a wagon platform. In the lamplight of that dining room, with her back straight and her hands on the table and those dark eyes catching the candle, She was one of the finest-looking women I had been within arm's reach of in 10 or 12 years. I didn't say so. It wasn't the time for that, and she would have known what I was doing anyway. We talked for the better part of 2.5 hours. She talked about the panhandle and what her father had done wrong, which was mainly to borrow against acreage he didn't own outright, and not to fully understand what that meant until it was too late. She talked about Alem and his death and what it had been, a fever, fast. He was gone in 9 days. And about the particular confusion of grief when you're also suddenly alone with a failing operation and no one to help you think. She talked about Colbert's first visit, and how she'd known what he was doing and not been able to stop it. The way you watch something coming from a distance and keep thinking you'll do something different and then don't. I listened. I'd become a reasonably good listener over the years, partly by intention and partly because it was easier than talking about myself. She asked about myself and I told her, which was not my usual way. The ranch in New Mexico Territory, the years I'd built it, the wife who died of a thing the doctor couldn't name and couldn't treat. The fire that came 2 years after, fast in a dry summer, took the house and the barn and 14 head before I got the rest clear. The long cattle work that came after, following herds north and south and west, because I was good at it, and because it kept me from thinking too hard about what I didn't have. She said, "Do you miss having ground?" I said, "Every day." She said, "What would you go back to, if you went back?" I thought about it. I'd thought about it before, many times in camps like the one we'd made in the Cottonwood Draw, lying awake listening to water. I said, "Smaller than what I had, something I can see all the way across. Good water, good grass, enough cattle to make a living and not so many you can't look at them all by Tuesday." I stopped. "And a house that's weather-tight and a stove that draws right. I've slept cold more winters than I needed to." She smiled. It was a restrained smile, not shy, just careful, given only when earned. I noticed it went all the way up to her eyes. She said, "That sounds exactly right." I said, "Does it?" She said, "Too much land costs you. My father didn't know that. He thought more ground was always better." She turned her coffee cup. "What you need is enough. Enough is a harder number to know than more." I said, "That's very true." She said, "What I'd want," she stopped, started again. "What I'd want is ground I know by name. Every wash, every spring, every place the grass goes thin in August. I want to know where the water comes from and where it goes." I said, "I know a piece of land about 40 miles south of here. Creek bottom land, good timber, cuts through into a valley that's wide enough but not too wide. I've ridden past it twice, and both times I thought about stopping." She looked at me. I said, "I didn't. Both times I had cattle to deliver somewhere." She said after a moment, "Is that so?" I said, "It is." She said, "You should stop being careful and say what you mean." I said, "I thought I was saying it." She said, "You're working up to it, which I appreciate, but you've been working up to it since the coffee this morning, so." I said, "All right." I told her what I had in mind, what I was thinking, what I hoped might be possible if she was willing to consider it. Not the next week, things needed to settle first, the lawyer business needed finishing, and I wasn't a man who made decisions fast because they felt urgent. But after, what after might look like. She was quiet for a long time. People moved around us in the restaurant, ate their suppers, talked. The candle between us burned lower. She said, "I need you to understand some things about me." I said, "Tell me." She said, "What happened at Gulliver's Crossing, I won't pretend it didn't. I won't put it somewhere I don't look at it and go on as if I'm somebody who hasn't had that done to her. It's in me now, and it stays in me." I said, "I know." She said, "Some men want a woman who puts things behind her." I said, "I'm not that man." She said, "I have opinions, strongly held ones about a lot of things, and I will say them out loud." I said, "I noticed." She said, "And I won't be told what I owe somebody. I spent a long time figuring out that what you owe a person and what they tell you you owe them are two different calculations, and I'm going to be the one doing mine. I said, Ruth, I paid $250 because I couldn't sit on a horse and watch that continue. I did not buy you. What you do now and where you go and who you do it with, those are your choices, not mine. I paid money for a man to stop doing something, and that's the whole of what I bought. She looked at me, long and straight. She said, most men don't know the difference between those two things. I said, I know. I've watched men not know it my whole life. She said after a while, you lost someone, a wife, and then a ranch. I said, yes. She said, and you've been out on the range ever since, 12 years. I said, about that. She said, that's a long time to be alone. I said, yes. She said, I'm not going to rescue you from it. I said, I'm not asking to be rescued. She said, what are you asking? I said, a chance, to be something useful to somebody in a place worth staying in. With a good woman who has her own opinions and doesn't need managing. That small thing happened at the corner of her mouth again, the careful smile. She kept it short. She said, you make it sound practical. I said, I'm a practical man. She said, I can tell. She turned her cup. Then she put it down and put her hands flat on the table. She said, I need the lawyer business finished first. I said, I figured. She said, and I need you not to hover while it's happening. I need to do it myself. I said, I'll stay in town. I won't hover. She said, if Colbert sends anyone. I said, then you come and find me. She said, all right. I said, all right. We walked back along the main street in the cold. She walked beside me, not close, our sleeves not quite touching. In front of the hardware store, she stopped and looked at a plow in the window, a new one, nicely fitted, and she stood there looking at it for a moment. She said, is that a good plow? I said, it's decent. I'd want to look at the share, that's where they cut corners on the cheaper ones. She said, I said nothing. I stood beside her and looked at the plow. Then she turned to me and looked at me directly in that way of hers, complete and without deflection, and she said, 40 miles south. I said, give or take. She said, good water. I said, creek runs clear. I checked it twice. She said, okay, Harlan. I said, okay, Ruth. She went up the street to the hotel. I stood in front of the hardware store in the cold for a while and looked at the plow, and then I went back to the saloon and found Cutter still at his cards. He said, how was dinner? I said, good. He said, more than a few days. I said, probably. He said, That was Cutter. The lawyer was a man named Alcott, office on the side street behind the bank. He had the look of a man who had once believed in the law as a thing of real dignity and had since accumulated enough experience to make him careful about that belief, but had not yet let go of it entirely, which I thought was the right place to be. He was thorough, and he was patient, and he did not talk too much, all of which I respected. Ruth laid her situation out for him in about 15 minutes, and he asked maybe a dozen questions and wrote things in a ledger of his own, which I thought was a nice reversal of the situation. He said he would need to write 3 letters and likely make 1 trip to the county seat. He said it would take 4 to 6 weeks. She said she understood. I stayed. Every day in Marcy's Ford, I found something useful to do, because I was not built for idleness, and because a man who's trying to stay in a town without a reason needs to make himself a reason. I helped a farmer named Stubbs west of town put up new fence across 300 yards of ground so rocky that the post hole digging alone took 4 days, and left both of us exhausted and irritable. I shod horses for the livery for 2 weeks in exchange for boarding my own horses and keeping a few dollars in my pocket. I found a family on the south end of town whose well had gone contaminated, bad taste, animals refusing to drink from it, a dead dog they'd found nearby, and spent 2 days finding the source of the problem, which was a drainage ditch from their privy that had gotten too close, and 2 more days digging a new well in the right place. I was good at work. I had always been good at work. It was a thing I knew about myself and was reasonably comfortable with. Most evenings I had dinner with Ruth. Not every evening she had her own work to do, had taken on correspondence duties for Alcott's wife in exchange for a reduction in legal fees, and had her own life to arrange in that hotel room, meals and laundry, and the 100 small management tasks of a life in temporary housing. I didn't need to fill every hour of her day. I didn't want to. I had enough sense to know that a woman who has recently had her life taken from her and is in the process of rebuilding it doesn't need a man filling up all the space. But most evenings, at the restaurant with the tablecloths, or at the counter at the back of the mercantile that served soup and bread in the evenings for a nickel, or sometimes just at the bench outside the hotel in the cold when she wanted air more than she wanted food. We talked. That's the simplest way to say it and the most accurate. We talked and I listened and she listened back, which not everyone does, and after a few weeks I stopped being careful about what I said because it turned out there was nothing I could say that she would use wrong. She asked sharp questions and got answers that surprised me, pulled out of me by the quality of her attention. I talked about my father, who I hadn't talked about in years. About the fire, about the thing the fire felt like in the body, the particular loss of something you built with your hands and your time. About the years after, the long cattle work, about what it does to you to be always moving, always temporary, always leaving. She listened to all of it. Not with sympathy exactly, not the kind that requires you to comfort the person giving it. More like she just held the space of it, made room for the weight of it to sit between us without either of us having to lift it all the time. She told me about her father, a man of large plans and complicated feelings, generous and frustrating in equal measure. About her mother, who had died when Ruth was 12. About growing up the eldest of 3 daughters on land that kept threatening to fail and mostly didn't. About marrying a Lem at 19 and what she'd known and not known about what she was doing. She said, about 2 weeks in, I think I believed that being someone's wife would feel more like land and less like weather. I said, what do you mean? She said, land you know. Land stays where it is. Land you can learn, whether you just live in. I thought about that. I said, which was it? She said, with a Lem, weather mostly. She looked out the window of the restaurant. He was a decent man, like I said, but he didn't stay where he was. His moods, his plans, his worries. You never quite knew what you'd have the next day. I said, and what would land feel like? She looked at me. She said, I expect I'll know when I find it. Alcott came back from the county seat on a Thursday 3 weeks into the business, with a document showing that the debt from a Lem's estate had been fully satisfied 18 months prior by the land transfer, that the ongoing claim in Colbert's ledger was without basis in fact, and that Ruth Lem was owed 4 months of unpaid wages plus damages for the unlawful indenture proceeding at Gulliver's Crossing. He said Colbert would likely not pay the full damages without further proceedings. He said that was her call to make. She said, I'll take what he'll pay without arguing and sign a release. I don't want to spend another 6 weeks in Marcy's Ford. Alcott said, that's sensible. She said, is there any way to get back the land? He said, unlikely. The transfer was legal at the time, under the terms of the original debt. She said, even though the ongoing debt wasn't real. He said, the transfer settled the real portion of the debt. What he manufactured after was a separate wrong, but recovering those titles would require a suit and years. She looked at the wall for a moment. She said, all right. She came out of Alcott's office with a check for a sum that wasn't large but was hers by right, and she stood on the board sidewalk in the November cold and held it in both hands and looked at it. I was standing to the side. She said without looking up, the land is still his. I said, I know. She said, that bothers me more than anything else. I said, I know. She said, I suppose it always will. I said, probably. Some things don't go away, they just get smaller. She looked at me. She said, is that true, from experience? I said, from a lot of experience, yes. She folded the check carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Then she stood up straight and took a slow breath of the cold air. She said, well, 40 miles south. I said, ready when you are. She said, tomorrow morning. I said, I'll get the horses ready. We rode south out of Marcy's Ford on a clear November morning, Cutter and Preacher heading west where they'd agreed to meet a man about a spring drive, Ruth and I cutting south on the Copperhead Road, and then leaving it at the Second Creek crossing, where I knew the trail that went down into the valley. The land was there, same as I'd remembered it, better maybe in November, the grass along the creek still thick and dry rather than gone, the cottonwood stripped but the timber on the ridge behind full and dark, the valley floor wide enough for a real operation and tight enough on the sides to feel like something held you in. There was an old soddy on the south end, abandoned, the roof half in but the walls solid adobe, which told you a fair amount about the bones of the place. A man had tried here. He hadn't stayed, but the land wasn't why he'd left. We stopped our horses on the rise above the valley and looked down at it. She said after a while, where's the water come from? I pointed to the north end where the creek bent out of the ridge. I said, there's a spring up that canyon about a quarter mile. I checked it both times I came through. Clean, cold, strong flow even in dry years, you can tell by the moss on the rocks above the bend. She said, and it goes. I said, south through the valley and out through a cut in the far end. Meets the Copperhead about 3 miles down. She said, so we'd have first use. I said, first use. She looked at the valley a while longer. She said, it's good ground. I said, yes. She said, the soddy walls will do for the first winter if we work the roof. I said, I can have it tight in 2 weeks. She said, I'll help. I said, I know. She turned her horse and looked at me directly. She said, you understand what I'm saying yes to? I said, I think so. She said, tell me. I said, the ground, the work, the life that comes from both of them. I stopped. And you deciding what else on your own time. She said, yes. I said, that's what I understand. She said, all right then. She turned her horse back toward the valley and started down the slope. The first winter was hard. Cold that came in under the door no matter what you stuffed in the gaps. Wood running short in January because I'd underestimated the burn rate in a new stove with a new draw. A sickness in 4 of the cattle I'd bought in November that I didn't identify fast enough and lost the 4 before I figured what it was and separated the rest. Mistakes, all of them, the kind you make the first year in new ground and try not to make the second. Ruth said almost nothing during any of it, she just worked. I'd seen her work on the trail, and I'd seen her work on the soddy repairs in November, but that first winter I saw the full scope of it. She worked with an efficiency I've rarely seen in a man or a woman, no wasted motion, no complaint about the nature of a task, no waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. She just looked at what needed doing and did it. In the worst of the cold, when I was burning more wood than we had and spending half the day hauling and splitting, she was doing 3 other things, patching a leak, repairing a harness, getting a stew on that would last 2 days. I came in one February evening with my hands so cold I could barely feel the axe, and she handed me a cup of coffee without looking up from the table where she was sewing a patch into the bedroll. And there was a warmth in the soddy I hadn't felt in a week. And I looked up and saw she'd fixed the stovepipe joint that had been drafting cold air in from the side, bending the metal back and sealing it with a clay mixture she'd made from the floor of the draw. I stood there in my coat and looked at what she'd done. She said without looking up, take your boots off, you're tracking mud. I loved her then. I want to be plain about it. I had already understood what I felt, had known it since the ride south, but that was the moment I felt the full weight of it, standing in a warm room that hadn't been warm that morning, being told to take my boots off. I said, I don't deserve this. She looked up then, quick and direct. She said, don't say things like that. I said, why? She said, because it puts the wrong frame around it. You work hard. I work hard. We keep each other. That's not a debt, Harlan. That's just what this is. I took my boots off. Spring came. We rebuilt the roof on what was now a real house, adobe with a proper timber frame, tight as I'd promised. A barn went up over the summer, preacher coming back to help for 6 weeks in exchange for wages and Ruth's cooking, which he said was worth more than the wages. Fencing went in, miles of it, over 2 summers. The cattle herd grew slowly and well, buying right, selling right, letting the animals tell you what the land would hold and not pushing past it. We had neighbors by the 2nd year. The Steen family came in 12 miles east, husband and wife and 2 boys, and then the Bright family about 15 south. Good people, careful and steady. We helped them as they needed and they helped us, which is how that country worked. You had to be able to do everything yourself, and you also had to know when to ask. They came to me for land questions and livestock questions and the particular mechanical problems of a working ranch. They came to Ruth for the harder things. A child sick with something the doctor in Marcy's Ford couldn't name. A bad winter and running short of what you needed to run short of and how to manage your fear. A husband and wife whose marriage had gone cold and mean, and who needed someone to talk to who would not take sides and would not tell anyone. She handled all of it. She handled it the way she handled everything, complete and careful, seeing the whole of what was in front of her. In the 3rd year, Bates Steen had a child that came 6 weeks too early. The baby was alive but struggling, and the doctor in Marcy's Ford said there was nothing more to do and to pray. Ruth rode out there in January, in a cold that would have kept most people inside, and she sat with Bates Steen for 36 hours. Didn't sleep. I rode out on the 2nd morning with food and firewood, and she came to the door and said the boy was holding on and to leave the food and go home. I went home. She came back on the 3rd morning. She sat down at the table and said, he's going to be fine. I said, and you? She said, I need to sleep. I said, sleep. She slept 12 hours. When she woke up, she came and found me in the barn where I was mending harness in the afternoon light, and she leaned against me. Just leaned, her forehead against the side of my neck, her hands at her sides, not quite an embrace, just her weight against mine, solid and quiet. She did that sometimes when something had cost her, just came and stood against me, and I put my arm around her and let her have the quiet and didn't ask for anything else. After a while she said, thank you for knowing when to stay out of the way. I said, I've had practice. She said, you're better at it than most men. I said, it's not complicated. When a woman knows what she's doing, you get out of the way. She leaned against me a moment longer. Then she said, your harness has a bad splice in the cheekpiece. I can see it from here. I looked, she was right. I said, how do you see everything? She said, I pay attention. I'm old now, older than I thought I'd get when I was the age that dying felt like something that happened to other people. 68 this past March, which means I've been on this ground going on 22 years, though I'll tell you honestly, it doesn't feel like 22 years. It feels like one long, continuous day with a lot of seasons in it. The house is bigger than the soddy was. The barn's been rebuilt twice. The cattle operation is what I wanted it to be from the start, not too large, nothing I can't see all the way across, everything I need and nothing I don't. The creek runs clean through the north end of the valley and out through the cut at the south, same as it always has, and I know every bend of it by the sound it makes. Ruth's hair has gone mostly gray. She's noticed but hasn't said anything about it, or if she has, it was to herself, and that seems about right for her. She still has her garden, and it's still larger than it needs to be, and most of it still grows. She still has opinions about irrigation and the railroad and the right way to winter cattle, and she still says them out loud. I've learned to make good arguments when I disagree with her, because she responds to good arguments, and I've learned to recognize when she's right and say so, because she respects that too. Last fall, the Steen boy, the one that came too early in January of the third year, turned 20 and came over to help me with the fencing on the East Ridge. He's a big young man now, his father's height and his mother's calm, hands that know work, a good disposition. We put in a full day on the ridge, and at the end of it he sat on the fence rail with his hat on his knee and said, "Mr. Price, can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." He said, "My mother always says that your wife saved my life. Is that true?" I said, 36 hours of her refusing to let you go. Yes. He thought about that. He said, "She seems like a person who would do that." I said, "She is." He said, "What does she think about this place, after all this time?" I said, "You should ask her." He asked her that evening, over supper that she'd made from a deer I'd taken the week before and kept in the cold. He said, "Mrs. Price, do you like it here? After all this time?" Ruth set down her spoon and looked at him with that quality she had, complete and careful, as if the question deserved the full weight of her attention. Then she looked at me. Just for a moment. Across the table in the lamplight that I have sat in every evening for 22 years. She looked at me, and then she looked back at the boy and said, "There is nowhere I would rather be." She held my eyes when she said it. The beat after she turned back to him, she still held my eyes, long enough to make it plain who the sentence was for. Then she handed him more bread and asked about his father's fence problem on the south pasture, and the evening went on. That was everything. I've tried to say what it was, and I can't do it without making it smaller than it is. So I'll just say it was everything and leave it there. The south window of this room catches the last of the afternoon and throws a long strip of it across the floor. When the work is done and the day is going well, and the stove is drawing right and she's in the other room doing whatever she's doing, I sometimes just stand in that strip of light for a minute. Just stand there in the sun like I've got all the time in the world, which at 68 I do not, but it feels that way. 68 years old, standing in a strip of afternoon sunlight. Here I am,